So welcome. The Integritas Institute is an educational department of the St. John Paul II Newman Center here at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And we try to bring Catholic wisdom to the table that applies to business ethics and also bioethics. My name is Chris Saliga. I'm a Catholic priest, and I'm the interim director of the bioethics component part of the Institute. And so thank you for coming today. We don't operate in a bubble. We're really grateful to both the Catholic Medical Students Association and the Christian Dental Students Association who help us get the word out, help us get the space available to have these events. And today, we're very thankful to Pompeii Pizza right here on Taylor Street. They donated free lunch, so I wanted to mention that. Now, Mike Aquilina, we're really blessed, Mike, to have you here. Thank you for your generosity. Mike's in town for another event, and he's doing this, helping us out completely pro bono. So thank you for your gift. This is a great gift. Mike is an author and an editor of more than 40 books, including The Fathers of the Church, The Mass of the Early Christians, and Angels of God. Many of his works are in various languages, including Braille. That's pretty cool. When you get your stuff translated into Braille, I think that's a bragging point. He's published hundreds of articles, essays, and reviews in journals such as First Things, Touchstone, Crisis Magazine, Our Sunday Visitor, the National Catholic Register, Columbia, and Catholic Heritage, to name but a few. He contributed work on early Christianity to the Encyclopedia of Catholic Social Thought, and he's received honors from the Catholic Press Association, including Best Magazine for New Covenant during his period of editorship there. He's also a poet whose works have appeared in U.S. literary journals and elsewhere in translation. He shares songwriting credits with Grammy Award winner Dion and on critically acclaimed albums such as Tank Full of Blues in 2012 and New York Is My Home in 2015. Mike is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Penn State University, where he finished with honors and high distinction. He received Penn State's Oswald's Award for Achievement in Journalism and Mass Media. He has for many years now served as a consultant and collaborator to scholars, artists, church leaders as well, helping them to produce books, speeches, and essays. He and his wife Terry have been married since 1985. They have 6 children who are the subject of his book, Love in the Little Things, and he also has 2 grandchildren. Now, you'll notice Mike has some of his books with him. Today's presentation is coming out of this most recent of his books, The Healing Imperative, The Early Church and the Invention of Medicine as We Know It. And this book is widely available if you don't pick up a copy today. And for those listening, we're going to post this presentation online. This book can be found online very easily. CatholicBooksDirect.com, Amazon.com, Mike's webpage. It's all over the place. So, without further delay, I present to you Mike Aquilina.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Father Chris. It's an honor for me to speak with you today. I'm in awe of the vocation God has given you, and I'm grateful for the way you're responding by working as hard as you're working, either in the field or in medical school right now. I've been blessed all my life by the care of Christian physicians. And I'd like to open today by telling you just a bit about the one who was my primary care physician the longest. His name was Tony Galetta. And at the time of his death in 2011, Tony was 77 years old and had been contending with many ailments, most significantly congestive heart failure. The last time he saw me, he carried his oxygen in with me into the treatment room, and he apologized for that. And he sat for most of his time with me. And he apologized for that. But he smiled, as always, through our encounter. And he relieved my double ear infection in time for me to get on the road and drive to Cincinnati for a speaking engagement later that week. Tony Galletta loved life, and he exuded a joy that was so communicable it should have been tracked by the CDC. He enjoyed homemade red wine, garlic, Italian sausage, opera, unhealthy pastries, Dante, raucous conversation, and the company of those he called his cari amici, his dear friends. And to all of these things he was very much attached. But to nothing was he attached as he was to the medical profession. As a medical student in the Philippines in the 1950s, Tony spent his free time, you know how much free time you have in medical school, right? He spent his free time working at a Catholic medical mission clinic in the country's mountainous provinces. And he saw that the nun who ran the clinic was overwhelmed. And so he recruited an army of his fellow classmates to join him in giving away their free time. Eventually, his medical school, the University of Santo Tomas, made Tony's mission part of its fourth-year curriculum. By 1983, when the program honored Tony as its founder, more than 300,000 impoverished people had received medical services there. This is my PCP. Dr. Galletta also volunteered as medical director of the Brothers Brother Foundation of Pittsburgh. He conducted medical missions to Nicaragua, Romania, Vietnam, and elsewhere. He was always arranging a shipment of pills and crutches, machinery, or ambulances to some remote spot on the planet. I'm an eyewitness, and I can testify that Tony Galletta was in his office almost till the moment of his last hospitalization, and his waiting room was always full. He belonged to us, his patients, in the same way that our parish priests belong to us as Catholics. And he communicated that to us. His bond with us was vocational. It had come from God, and he wasn't afraid to acknowledge that. Tony Galletta loved Jesus, and his eyes would well up with tears when he talked about Jesus. He had heard our Lord issue a command to heal, what I call the healing imperative. Tony had heard the apostles urge Christians to practice hospitality, and he had responded with determination, as Christian physicians have always responded. And it's to that kind of response, in fact, that we owe the emergence of the institution that we've come to know as the hospital. And it's the story of the hospital's development that I've come to tell today. And I'd like to dedicate my telling of that story to Tony Galletta. From the beginning, we should be very clear about one thing. The hospital arose as a Christian institution. A Christian institution utterly dependent on Christian principles. The standard medical school textbooks agree on this point. Dr. Roy Porter, in his Medical History of Mankind, states simply, Christianity planted the hospital. Christianity planted it. The institution we know today has grown from a seed planted by Christians. And that seed was a common ethos of charity, he says. Gunter Rissa, in his own History of Hospitals, speaks of Christianity constructing a mission of healing. And the foremost expert on the early history of the hospital, Dr. Gary Ferngren, made the same point most emphatically in his recent historical survey published by Johns Hopkins University. And I want to read this because it's a striking statement from an eminent historian of science. Here's what he says. The hospital was, in origin and conception, a distinctively Christian institution, rooted in Christian concepts of charity and philanthropy. There were no pre-Christian institutions in the ancient world that served the purpose that Christian hospitals were created to serve. None of the provisions for health care in classical times resembled hospitals as they developed in the late 4th century. And that's astonishing, really. And it bears repeating. There were no pre-Christian institutions that served the purpose that hospitals were created to serve. There were none. Not one. Now, it's not that there was no one practicing medicine of a sort back then. In classical antiquity, there were many professionals in the healing arts. What passed for the medical profession was a riot of different types of practitioner. Many took up some strain of the Hippocratic tradition. But others were herbalists, soothsayers, magicians, or folk healers. People calling themselves medici, writes one scholar, were an odd mixture of the very highly selected and the self-appointed, with a wide range of ability, qualifications, and prestige. There was no board to certify anyone. There were no medical schools to grant diplomas. Surely many professional healers underwent an apprenticeship of sorts, and usually it was a son apprenticing with his father. That's the way it usually happened. Many practitioners in antiquity made their living by wandering from town to town, and they were usually, probably, outrunning the public response to their latest failure. Some made their way across entire continents in the course of their career, running as fast as they could from the last failure. From the wisecracks we find in the Bible and other ancient literature, it seems that sick people understood that it was a risky proposition to seek healing, to go to the doctor. Medicine in the 1st centuries AD was an uncertain and unstable business. Why? Well, the wandering Medici had no roots, no local loyalties, no lasting accountability to anyone, no supervision. They had no institutional form because there was no institutional form available to them. The Greeks and Romans had temples of Asclepius, the god of healing, and sick people could go there to pray and offer sacrifice in hope of a cure. Now, treatment in such places was usually based on the interpretation of dreams that were dreamt by the sick person while in a period of incubation in a chapel, in a sanctuary. While the Asclepian temples may have provided some occasional relief, I mean, people were going there. They were getting rest. They were getting away from home. Sometimes that's all you need. They weren't hospitals. They kept no long-term patients. They offered no extended program of treatment on site. The nearest approximation of a hospital that we find in classical antiquity is something called the valetudinarium. The valetudinarium was essentially a repair shop for slaves and for soldiers, because every slave and every soldier represented an important long-term investment from either the state or from a family or from a business. You needed your slave to be healthy, productive, working, efficient. So if the slave broke down, you took it to the repair shop. That's the closest thing we have to a hospital in classical antiquity, because it's the only thing that was sustainable. You see, both soldiers and slaves, as I said, they represented huge investments, and they were supposed to last years and even decades for their employers, for their owners. And so the ancients established places where this human property could be restored to productivity. As far as we know, the Romans never entertained the idea of providing valetudinaria for the wider population. And it's difficult to see how they could have made one profitable or sustainable. And yet there was, as there always has been and always will be, a great demand for medical care. Pain, sickness, and discomfort are characteristic of the human condition ever since the fall of Adam and Eve. And those who suffered went looking, sometimes desperately, for relief. Well, that was the world into which the Christ was born. And it was to heal that world that the Christ came. When asked to verify his own mission, Jesus presented physical cures as his evidence. Look, the blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. Lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up. Healing, then, was an essential part of Jesus' ministry. It wasn't something incidental. In addition to the ailments I've already mentioned, that Jesus is mentioning there, he also cured dropsy, paralysis, palsy, hemorrhage, so many other things. Most surprisingly, he cured not only his fellow countrymen, not only his fellow Jews, but also Samaritans, pagan Syrophoenicians, and even the hated Romans, even the enemy. And doing this, he provided a model for healers who would follow him. His cures were unmistakably physical, but John the Evangelist tells us that they were also signs. That is, they stood for something else. They pointed beyond themselves. They pointed to something greater. They were signs of a deeper healing, the healing of a wound in the fabric of creation. But they were nonetheless real and true healings. The blind really did receive their sight. The lame really did walk. And lepers really were cleansed. Neither Jesus nor his disciples have offered these cures. They couldn't have offered these cures as evidence if people could have simply denied them or dismissed their claims. They had to be real. Even 30 years later, 40 years later, when the Gospels were set down, you could still call out the followers of Jesus on these claims and have them make good on them. So Jesus sends the 70 out on their first mission. And he instructs them to heal the sick, and say to them, the kingdom of God has come near to you. And we should note well that the command to heal precedes the command to proclaim the kingdom. It's as if physical healing is a necessary step of pre-evangelization. Or maybe Jesus intended that the kingdom should manifest itself first through deeds of healing, and then simply be confirmed by the disciples' words of proclamation. Well, the disciples were faithful to Jesus' command. They marveled at their success as they returned from that first mission. And that was only the beginning. The book right after the Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, tells the story of the early history of the church. And there, the book begins, more or less, by recounting the miraculous cures that were worked by Peter and John. Later, in the Acts of the Apostles, Paul takes up the healing mission of Jesus. On the island of Malta, he heals a man who lay sick with fever and dysentery. And what happens next? It's predictable. Then, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. The apostles, like Jesus before them, were known for their healing ministry as much as their preaching. They were faithful to the command of Jesus, and they were faithful to the model of Jesus. And the situation remained the same with the passing of the apostolic generation. What's interesting about the following years is the emphasis in the writings of the early Christians on Jesus as a healer. Ignatius of Antioch, writing in 107 AD, spoke of the Lord as a physician. And the early historian Eusebius described Jesus' ministry with lines taken directly from Hippocrates. He wants to describe Jesus, but he's describing him with lines from Hippocrates. This is the quote. "A devoted physician, to save the lives of the sick, sees the horrible danger, yet touches the infected place, and in treating another man's troubles, brings suffering on himself." The best description Eusebius could find of the work of Jesus was the work of a physician. That's the ideal doctor for Hippocrates. And for Eusebius, it's Jesus Christ. Christians, in their turn, instinctively responded to Jesus' healing imperative. And how did they do this? They did this by dedicating their lives to the practice of medicine. Justin Martyr in the 2nd century and Origen in the 3rd century both testify that many of their co-religionists were medical doctors. Gary Ferngren cites studies of the professional makeup of the early church, and I love this. I love this little fact from early Christian history. He concludes that some 150 physicians can be identified with reasonable certainty from the Roman imperial period. He goes on to say that no other professional group comes close to the number of physicians that are mentioned in the Latin inscriptions alone. And that's only the Western Christians. Most of the physicians came from the East. So in the East, the physicians would have been even more numerous. Those inscriptions haven't been inventoried yet. But when you look at the Western inscriptions, no other group is as numerous as the doctors. Not plumbers or carpenters or seamstresses or merchants. Not bankers or soldiers or barristers or cooks. Though all professions were well represented in the early church, doctors make up the single largest cohort. That's amazing. From this we might conclude that doctors were, more than any other professional group, drawn to Christianity. Or maybe it was Christians who were drawn to medical practice more than to any other kind of work, because of its resemblance to the work of Jesus Christ. In any case, the statistics suggest much about the compatibility and similarity between the life of grace and a doctor's life of service. There was, however, no distinctively Christian way of practicing medicine. There was no distinctively Christian method of doing medicine. Christian practice reflected the variety of methods and theories available at the time. From the evidence, from the documentary evidence, it seems that Christians tended to favor the Hippocratic and empirical traditions, which kept the believing doctors at a safe distance from pagan religions. There you didn't have to swear the same oaths to the gods. You didn't have to offer sacrifice to the gods or traffic with demonic spirits. So the Christians leaned in those directions. Christians in medicine were distinguished only by what they refused to do. According to Gary Ferngren, those early Christian doctors, like their modern counterparts, would take no part in abortion, assisted suicide, cosmetic castration, and infanticide, nor would they prescribe contraceptive drugs. But that's not all they refused to do. They also refused to turn patients away, because Christian physicians, like Christians generally, believed themselves bound by a second New Testament imperative. They found in the New Testament a command and a corresponding duty to practice unrestricted hospitality. It's an important word, hospitality. The exhortation appears often in the letters of St. Peter and St. Paul, in the pastoral epistles, and in the letter to the Hebrews. St. Peter commands, this is a quote, "Practice hospitality ungrudgingly to one another." And the most famous formula for hospitality is this: "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." That's from the letter to the Hebrews. This second imperative inspired Christian physicians to care not only for their own tribe, but also for strangers, and even for their persecutors, even for their enemies. It is, in fact, during the first large-scale Roman persecution that we find the earliest ancestor of what we know as the hospital. Gary Ferngren writes that it was the Great Plague of the mid-3rd century that provided the church with its greatest opportunity for the broad extension of medical charity. Its ministry to the sick had hitherto been inwardly directed, largely to its own adherents. Increasingly, Christian medical care became outwardly focused, now enlarged to include many who were victims of the plague, both pagans and Christians without distinction. The plague that year, 250, was smallpox. And it hit the major cities of the empire hard. At its most deadly phase, we're told, it was killing thousands of people per day in Rome alone. It may have reduced the population of the empire by 30%. It raged intermittently for at least 20 years, claiming the lives of emperors, but also nameless multitudes. Today we know this pandemic as the plague of Cyprian because of the church father whose letters describe it most extensively for us. The disease was a matter of great concern for Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage. It was important not only because it was killing Christians, but also because the Roman authorities were blaming the Christians for the spread of the disease. Why was that? Well, what causes plague? What causes smallpox? You know. The thing that causes smallpox is that you're not offering sacrifice to the gods. Right? It's the natural conclusion. So the authorities looked at this and they made the Christians a scapegoat for the epidemic. And they began to require sacrifice of everyone who lived in their cities. And in order to sustain a life in the city, you had to be able to produce your libellus, your ticket, your proof, signed by the magistrate, that you had offered sacrifice to the gods, the genius of the emperor. Yet amid this simultaneous epidemic and persecution, the church inaugurated its first broad extension of medical charity. Cyprian exhorted his congregation, saying, "There is nothing remarkable in cherishing merely our own people. We should love our enemies as well. The good should be done to all, not merely to the household of faith." So in the midst of the plague, the Christians served even their neighbors who were most unneighborly. Christian doctors treated not only their co-religionists, but also their pagan persecutors, who had inevitably come down with the disease, but were routinely abandoned in the streets by their families. You know who the first people to leave a city were when an epidemic hit? Who were the first people to leave? Take a guess. Anybody? The doctors were the first people to leave, right? Because they had read their medical textbooks. They knew what these symptoms added up to. And they understood nothing about what caused them. They knew nothing about microbes, right? And so the best thing they could do for their family was to take the family and run as far as they could from the city. And that's what they did. In an epidemic, the first people to leave were the doctors. And the second people to leave were the pagan priests. Because the pagan priests were bankers. If you wanted to take out a loan, you went to the temple to swear out a loan. The pagan priests had the means to take their families far away, and they did. They would abandon the sick from their families. And who took care of the sick who were abandoned? The Christians. And what do you think this did for the sick who survived? They wanted what these Christians had. This was not a local phenomenon in North Africa. We possess testimonies very similar to Cyprian's from other places of people talking about the same epidemic. We have one from Alexandria in Egypt. The great sociologist Rodney Stark noted that the Catholic Church grew throughout this period of simultaneous epidemic and persecution. The Catholic Church grew at a steady rate of 40% per decade. 40% per decade. And he believes it was largely due to this profound and unprecedented public witness of charity. The pattern emerged still more clearly in the following century, during the epidemic of 312. Well, by then the Christians were numerous in every major city. And in many of the major cities, Christians made up the majority of the common people. So their efforts were more effective, extensive, and visible. The historian Eusebius, who was an eyewitness, reports that Christians rounded up the huge numbers who had been reduced to scarecrows all over the city. and they distributed loaves to them all. They fed them. They gave them comfort care. They washed them. And doing that, they probably increased their survival chances by about 60%. Mere comfort care will do that. Gary Ferngren states emphatically that the only care of the sick and dying during the epidemic of 313 was provided by the Christian churches. He goes on to say, no charitable care of any kind, public or private, existed apart from Christian diaconal care, because there was no religious, philosophical, or social basis for it. In Christianity, however, there was a firm foundation for such medical care. It was there in the Gospels and the Epistles. It was clear in the tradition, preserved and conveyed by saints like Ignatius and Cyprian. Christ issued a healing imperative to his disciples, and the apostles specified that no one should be deemed unworthy of Christian care. It was in the 4th century, as Christians assumed a clear majority in the urban areas, that the institution of the hospital took form. During a famine in Syria, Ephraim the deacon commandeered public porticos to set up a 300-bed facility for the treatment of the ill. In 324, in Egypt, Pachomius established an infirmary in the vast monastery that he had founded in the vicinity of Alexandria. And near Rome, facilities were founded on the outskirts of the city by Fabiola and Pomacius. With the legalization of Christianity in 313 AD, such facilities emerged almost immediately as standard features of any city that was worthy of the name. The word civilized at root means cityfied. It means city-like. And now that cities were Christian, those residential facilities for the sick became non-negotiable terms of status. If you didn't have a place to house the sick, you weren't really a city. And you weren't really civilized. A recent historian defined a hospital as an institution that provides beds, meals, and constant nursing care for its patients while they undergo medical therapy at the hands of professional physicians. And these 4th century institutions fit that description. And they were everywhere. Some cities had as many as a half dozen of these hospitals by the end of the 4th century. But there was not yet a standard terminology for them in Greek or Latin. They were called by many different names. The greatest of them all was certainly the complex built by St. Basil the Great in Pontian Caesarea, what's now in Turkey. It was vast. It was so vast that the locals referred to it as the New City. And one contemporary observer compared it to the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was so great, it was like the pyramids. Basil's Catholic charities included not only a hospital, but also a soup kitchen, poorhouses, a trade school, a hostel for needy travelers, personal care for the elderly, and a hospice for the dying. The staff dispensed food and medical care to anyone who approached, regardless of their religious affiliation. Basil had difficulty finding a name for his institution, and so he called it all sorts of things. In one place he called it a poorhouse, in one of his letters. In another, a lodging. And yet another he calls it a hostel. The local folks just called it the Basileas, Basil's place. But the great thing about that name is that it's also a pun. It can also be translated as the kingdom. The kingdom. The double entendre was certainly intentional. Basil's closest friend, Gregory of Nazianzus, saw the city of Caesarea before and after the establishment of the Basileas. And he saw so stark a difference that he was moved to say this: "We have no longer to look on the fearful and pitiable sight of men looking like corpses before death, with the greater part of their limbs dead, driven from cities, from public places, from water courses. Basil it was, more than anyone, who persuaded those who are men not to scorn men, nor to dishonor Christ, the head of all, by their inhumanity toward human beings. Basil was an operator. He knew how to fundraise. He got the local civil authorities to donate to the Basileus. He got all of the wealthy. He reached them by letters, and he guilted them into contributing to his hospital to make it go. And he staffed it by celibate men and women who worked round the clock, alternating medical care with disciplined prayer. What Basil established as something unusual, a wonder of the world, soon became a standard feature of any major city. It was the most visible and concrete manifestation of Christian hospitality. Hospitality. And so in time, it came to be called a hospital. Once established, these places dedicated to medical care every day over the long haul for a large number of patients became de facto research institutions. Why is that? Because for the first time in the history of medicine, you had a stable institution where a team of doctors, not some solo practitioner who was running from town to town, but a team of doctors could work together watching the same conditions over a long period of time in a wide variety of patients. And they could see what worked, and they could see what didn't work, and they could draw conclusions from that. And that's what we call research. The Christian institution we call the hospital made that possible because it provided a stable place, a non-profit place, for this to occur. By the end of the 4th century, most of those hospitals made other developments as well. We have the first ambulance service developing then. We have the first paramedic service developing in these cities. What I love about the history of this time is that the ambulances and the paramedic services were staffed by gangs of rogue monks. They were tough because they had to get these sick people through these crowded city streets, and they had to be able to elbow people out of their way. So you had a certain kind of monk going for this life, right? This is what could develop because of the stable institution we know as the hospital. Their pharmacology is preserved for us in papyrus and parchment books in Eastern monasteries. And today, American pharmaceutical companies are funding studies of these books and translations of these books because they're banking on some cures that are in there, some remedies that we've lost over the years. How did the hospital happen? And how did it happen so quickly once Christianity was legal? No emperor mandated it. No law required it. Pagan antiquity had all the material ingredients for such an institution. The Greeks and Romans had doctors. They had valetudinaria, the repair shops for the slaves. There was ample demand for medical treatment. And yet neither the Greeks nor the Romans, nor the Chaldeans, nor the Egyptians, nor the Babylonians, nor the Assyrians ever produced a hospital. Ever. They had the material resources, but they lacked the spiritual resources. They lacked a belief in charity as self-giving love, life-giving love, self-sacrificing love, as a share in the life of God, an imitation of God's life, and a participation in the cruciform life of Jesus Christ. They lacked the belief in human dignity and universal brotherhood. These too are gifts of Christian religion to civilization. The pagans were ignorant of the divine command to heal and to show hospitality to friends and strangers alike, and even to enemies. The hospital could not have happened without Christianity. It did not happen in a pre-Christian world. And we should wonder then whether it can survive long in a post-Christian world. It's an honor for me to be here today. Because here I find myself among those who are the brave bearers in my day and in the day of my children and grandchildren of the healing tradition of Jesus and St. Paul, Pachomius and Fabiola, Ephraim and Basil. If ever you doubt the gravity of your vocation, if ever you fear you can't go on, remember the marvels the Lord has done through the medical care and hospitality of your spiritual ancestors. Remember what they accomplished in times of widespread and systematic persecution when they had access to no money and they were operating illegally. Remember that and give thanks to the Lord, for He is good. Remember today in your prayer to give glory to God for the deeds and witness of those ancestors in medicine and in faith. And I thank you for your hospitality to me today.